Welcome to the Leader's Edge podcast. I'm Sandy Laycox, editor-in-chief of Leader's Edge. In this installment of our podcast series with AXA XL, I talk with Steven Bauman, Global Programs and Captives Director for the Americas. We discuss the unprecedented growth in captives in recent years, new lines forming captives that haven't before, and how captives play a role in risk management and transfer for systemic risk. I hope you enjoy this deep dive on captives. I am here with Steven Bauman, Global Programs and Captives Director for the Americas for AXA XL. Welcome.
Thank you, Sandy. Great to be with you.
Excited to have you here on this Friday afternoon.
Yes.
We are going to talk all about captives, but I think maybe just for those of our listeners who aren't completely familiar with this type of product, why don't you go through just a quick overview of it and sort of any, current products that you're seeing in the captives area?
Yeah, sure. Very basic, a captive is an insurance company owned by the insured themselves. And the basic premise is it's for self-reliance, and self-resiliency. And it's a formal way of self-insuring themselves. And they're very much for the long-term risk management. And I like to keep it simple when it comes to captives, and simple in that there's really two different kinds of captives, basically, fundamentally. There's the single owner captive, and then there's the group owned captive. So as represented in the name, the single parent captive, single owner captive only has one owner, and likewise, the group has several owners, two or more, could be dozens, could be hundreds.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
that's
those can look very different, right? As we get into some of the more creative solutions out there.
Yeah, like I said, I like to keep it simple, but it does get very complicated. There's a lot of different names for kind of the same entities, depending on what domicile you're in, what part of the world you're in, and who's using them. Like you'll hear me refer to like a single owner captive as a single parent captive, because that's kind of when I started in the industry 35 years ago. That was it. Since then, there's been a lot of more names. There's, single parent, single owner, there's pure captive. Um, you know, a lot of different domiciles, different names, but fundamentally there's two separate, single and group.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk about the current market. You've mentioned unprecedented growth in captives right now. Tell us what you're seeing, and then what do you think is driving it?
Yeah, there, I say there's growth, and more growth, and breaking down the three growths, triple growth, right? So, first is the number of new captives. So new captive formations over the last 4 year has been unprecedented, in the 60 plus years of captive utilization. So in the last 4 years, exponential growth. One year, I think it was 2001 was more than, record breaking 2020. And, so just exponentially increase in the last 4 years. Um, and with that, so that's growth number one. With
Mm-hmm.
that is the number of lines of insurance going into captives has significantly grown, in the last 10 years.
Wow.
I would say now that there is probably not a line of insurance that doesn't go into captives. There used to be kind of some third rails, historically, but now every line of business is going into captives. So that's kind of, growth number two. And growth number three is just the premium dollars and other currencies around the world, whatever you want to put, whatever currency you're working in, the growth in premiums has increased significantly as well. So that's the kind of triple growth scenario that we're looking at. Just more captives around the world, more insurance using captives, and a lot more brokers and consultants, working with their clients and insurance carriers around captive utilization.
So can you point to anything in particular that you think first maybe might be driving that, the current sort of few-year boom of new captives, but also how you've seen over the longer term different lines entering the captive arena?
Yes, so I think it kind of comes back to being kind of resilient, like a self-resiliency, and that's what captives provides. So I think for any size company, that's their thought process. Um, and it's long-term commitment towards risk management, right? And it's just a better way of handling your losses. So I think, from kind of a technical look at risk management, I think it provides that solution that is long-term and endures with companies and corporations over time. Um, I think, just practically now, we mentioned there's a lot of different type of captives now. There's two fundamental, but there's different nuances to single parent captives. And what that has allowed, like cell captive, for instance, cell captive is like a single parent captive on training wheels. It's kind of, it's a good way for smaller companies to start. It's less costly. It's easier to get in and easier to get out of. And so they use that cell captive to start the captive process, to get the captive experience if they're not like a mega corporation. I mean, it used to be, captives, when I started many years ago, was only for the biggest corporations. But now it's trickled down the food chain. There's so many more companies using captives. You don't need over $1 million to use a captive anymore, and $1 million in premium. It's trickled down a lot lower. And so I think that has just, allowed for just the vast expansion of the industry, to have the captive experience. And I think it's a long-term commitment towards risk management. I think people like that.
Do you think business owners of maybe not just the large publicly traded companies, but do you think more smaller companies are becoming more aware of risk management and the need for a more sustainable sort of viewpoint?
I definitely think that, I think it's, and so that's a little bit of the science of risk management. Risks, there's no shortage of risk. Actually, risks are growing around the world, right? So that there's a need for a longer term view of how any company, whether it be small or big, is going to handle their risk. So it's always better, more efficient planning to think of the long term. And when you think of long term and you think of risk management, I mean, captives fits in that long term scenario for risk mitigation and long term planning for losses so well, whether it's a big company or a small company.
All right. You also mentioned new lines going into captives that you've never seen before. Earlier in our conversation, you talked about D&O when we were talking before this. Can you talk about that a little bit and some of those new business lines going and what might be driving that?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I started in the captive business in over 35 years ago. I hate to admit that, but yes. So, but with that, and back then, they were like a new thing. They were very entrepreneurial. But now I look at it now. Captives are more innovative and more entrepreneurial than they've ever been. And it's now a mature industry, and so I think that's so exciting to be a part of, as well as like you mentioned the new stuff that I've worked on. The first time this year, I've worked on a D&O program that utilized a captive, and so, but I've been doing this for 35 years. I've never worked on a D&O program, but we had a motivated client. We had great underwriters that wanted to do that, and we got it done. Now, companies do it very measured, and it's got to be, very well thought out, which we did, but we got it done. So, stuff like that is just so exciting. And that's in a line of coverage that's been around for forever, D&O. So exciting to see that kind of growth.
Do you know what might be happening at the business level where business owners are thinking, their D&O policy, they can't get what they need in a traditional space. So what might be driving that move to captive in that area?
Yeah, I think they may be getting it, from carriers like ourselves, but it comes back to that, long-term thinking and being self-reliant. They have it if this client had a captive, right? And they've used this captive over decades for many different things. And so that has allowed them to build up a capital and surplus in there that gives them the wherewithal to just take more risk and more risk and more risk. And so I think that, I think captives have kind of grown themselves into the C-suite of corporations, that they've built up a lot of confidence over the years now, right? So why not? Why not put more and more risks in there? And that was just D&O is a risk that every company's buying. But there's other stuff going into captives as well, whether it be warranty programs, whether it be helping out, with third-party risks and risks of suppliers and contractors. And, it's really endless, where a captive can go. And I think, with all the years of positive experience of captive utilization, I think more and more corporations are exploring all the possibilities.
Okay, so in the name of, you know, self-resilience and long-term risk management, we've talked in the past about some of these more challenging risks that are hard to cover when they have extreme loss possibilities, like cyber, like certain nat cat. Can you talk about captives as a solution or a partial solution as part of a creative solution for systemic risk?
Yeah, I think, systemic risks, so I guess based on that definition, they're all over the place, and they're massive, right? They're big, right? But if you kind of narrow it down to just, the basic distribution of risk, is what insurance is, and is what captives are involved in as well. If you start to break down the risk in smaller entities, everybody can better handle it collectively, right? So I think that's what's happening, with captive utilization and risks that, are systemic. Cyber or nat cat, some nat cat is called systemic as well. Um, but for an insured to kind of, bring it down to, well, what affects them? How can they help the bigger cause? Well, it's okay. It's taken more of their own risk, and it's taken that in a very systematic way, a very measured way in their own captive. So it's a treacherous systemic risk if it's all in one place and on one entity. But when you start to break it all up, and so not only to insurance companies around the world, but also to, the thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of captive entities around the world, it becomes more manageable. And so I think you're seeing captives, because there are so many now in the world and in the marketplace. I think you're seeing them diffuse all this, what we call systemic risk. And so it's just a further distribution of the risk, handled in a long-term manner.
And you are seeing it play out, maybe potentially a little bit, like, for example, in cyber, where, the premium increases have started to sort of settle down, and there is capacity out there, because a lot of it is being sort of taken off into, excess and surplus lines and other markets where you could sort of, I'm sure captives play a role in that.
Yeah, I mean, captives bring in, whether it be cyber or anything else, the captives automatically bring in a potential capacity to cover risk, right? So there's no doubt when prices start to go up, captive utilization starts to go up as well, right? And because, it's okay, it gets more difficult in the marketplace. Maybe if the capacity in the marketplace shrinks, captives kind of step in with their capacity and take the higher pricing into their captive. When it's advantageous for, corporations maybe to shop around a bit more for insurance, well, they take that latitude and they do that. Maybe they cut back on their captive a bit. But one of the I guess the things with captives, though, is once a corporation owns it, they want to use it, right? So they want to use their captive, so they will find ways to use it. And, as things tick up a little bit in premiums, I think you're going to see captive utilization continue to tick up, in that area, in those areas as well.
Well, Steven, this has been fascinating to talk about, and watching this marketplace is really interesting. Any final thoughts for our listeners on captives?
Yeah, I think there's so many areas for captives to play. I think the advice is to get some good partners that can help kind of, expand your captive utilization. There's a lot of great things going on in the marketplace, and I think it's a great time for captives, and the future is certainly very bright for captive utilization.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been great.
All right. Thanks for having me.
That was Steven Bauman, Global Programs and Captives Director for the Americas for AXA XL. For more in our AXA XL podcast series, go to leadersedge.com.